Hey everybody, Paul Turner here from the discipleproject.net here with another great interview for you. I am in an Airbnb here in South Florida. I am doing the wedding of a former camper who came. She wasn't in my youth group, but she came to camp every year to weekend retreats and summer retreats, and now I have the blessing of marrying her and her future husband, Justin. And so big shout out to Steph, big weekend, super proud of you. I would like to hear from you, though. This is another episode where I do an interview. This is from my podcast, so I've been doing it in both video and audio form, and you may not even know that I've had a podcast, so I'm going to leave a link down in the description below if you're interested in getting that on a regular basis, just like you get these videos. I don't do every episode of the podcast here. I really just do the interviews because I think they're so valuable and so important, but I would like your opinion. Do you like the long form videos where I do an interview with somebody? I would love to have your feedback, so leave me a comment down below. Today I have Heather Quiroz as she talks about getting back to the first century Jewish roots of youth ministry. It's a great book. It's a great interview. You are going to enjoy it. If you're brand new to the channel, thanks for checking it out. Be sure to hit the subscribe button before you leave, and that way you'll get videos like this in your inbox on a regular basis. So please join me for my interview with Heather Quiroz.
Throughout the land of Israel for like 3.5 weeks. And I went with Athletes in Action. A friend of mine, her name is Jessica, she just really encouraged me to go on this trip. She said, Heather, it's awesome. We explore the land of Israel. You'll play on a women's basketball team, and so you'll get to do some athletics, and you'll get to explore the Jewish roots of your faith. And I was like, okay, let's do it. And so I went, and that trip I'm not kidding you, like when I think about like the top 5 things of my life, that is right up there for sure. It forever changed my life. I saw the Bible come to life in a way I never experienced. Coming from the Western world, I never thought to contextualize Jesus in his Eastern world. And once I know, right? You'd think that would be pretty common, but not always the case.
And I understand.
Yeah. And I went there, and it was like, it was amazing. Our director, John, just made the Bible come to life in a way I'd never experienced before as he unpacked the Jewish roots of our faith. And so I just became super hungry about understanding the Jewish roots of our faith. And so once I got back from Israel, I was just reading and watching and listening to everything I could get my hands on that would help me better understand the treasure that I felt like I had found when I was in Israel in 2011. And so about 2 years ago, I went through a transition in my life where I stepped away from a long-term ministry that I was leading to kind of settle into this season of rest and healing. And
Yep.
during that period, during that time, I had extra time to kind of reflect and think. And I just thought to myself, I'm like, you know what if I combine the two things that I'm passionate about? Because I kept talking to these youth leaders around the country through the work that I do with ministry architects. And I kept hearing people say, we're trying to do discipleship, but we just feel like we're doing it wrong. And I just thought to myself, I'm like, maybe there's something there. Like maybe there's something for us to explore in the youth ministry community by what I've been thinking about through these last 7 or so years. And so I actually, when I was on this time of kind of stepping away from that ministry that I was leading, I actually wrote another book that didn't get published, but I threw it out to publishers, and I threw it out to the Youth Cartel, and Marco and the group over there. And he's like, Heather, this book is great, but it just doesn't fit what we need. And so I said, well, I have this other idea for a book. I haven't written it, but this is what I'm thinking. And I said, I've thought about like combining the Jewish roots of our faith with youth ministry. He's like, I'm really intrigued, Heather. And so I just sent him like the first chapter. I wrote the first chapter really fast, and he's like, I love it. Let's do it. And so that was a little over a year ago, and I wrote the book over the past year and just saw the Lord make it happen. It was awesome.
Well, yeah. that is always the best way for it to happen, isn't it? When it's
yeah.
When the Lord opens the doors and it's fluid for you. And
Yeah.
You just get into that zone, and it's just working. I love it when
Yeah.
that happens.
Yes.
It doesn't happen nearly enough for me, but but I'd like it to happen more.
I hear you on that for sure. Mhm.
um, Now tell us a little bit about, real quick, how long have you been in doing youth ministry? Now I know you stepped away from a position, but how long overall have you been working with students?
Wow. So I'm 35. So I started serving in youth ministry, I think about 19, I was 19 years old or something like that. And then
Uh-huh.
I stepped into full-time ministry probably when I was 24 or something like that. And so I worked at a church for about 9 years as a youth pastor on staff there. Kind of went through that transition. And my husband and I just recently moved to Shelbyville, Indiana, where I currently serve on staff at Shelbyville Community Church as a student ministries pastor. So
Oh, that is fantastic.
yeah.
Now, how close are you? I have to ask this because how close are you to South Bend?
I think South Bend is actually north of us. I think
Oh,
we're like 25 minutes south of Indianapolis.
okay.
So yeah,
And
it's
I
in.
always ask that when people I talk to are from Indiana, because I happen to be a big Notre Dame fan.
Oh, there you
So I
go.
want to know if you can see Touchdown Jesus from where you are.
I don't think I can.
You can't. Okay. All right. Well, I'm just checking. I try to map out, who lives near there, that in case you need a speaker or retreat speaker, I'm totally available. Just want to let you know.
Especially
I will
during
go. Huh?
yeah, game week, especially during game weekend, right? Uh-huh.
Exactly. And I
Uh-huh.
will, just letting people know, listening,
Yeah.
you on YouTube and the listening audience, I
Yeah.
will come for Notre Dame tickets.
There you go.
That's it. That's it. Nothing else is required.
Got it.
Um, maybe something from the concession stand.
Yeah, you bet.
Um, but so in this journey you've been on, I love the first part of your book here, in the opening chapter of your book. Once again, first century youth ministry, exploring our Jewish roots to reclaim discipleship. Links will be down in the show notes on YouTube, as well as in the podcast notes, where you can get the book wherever books are sold. Of course, it's going to be Amazon. I don't know where where does anybody else buy books, but that link will be there. If you love Books A Million, you can still go there. It could be there on the shelf, and I hope it is. But you have a quote there that says, "Is it possible that discipleship has been lacking in our culture because we inadvertently pulled up our Jewish roots?" So let's go ahead and dive into that then, and say, what do you mean that youth ministries have pulled up our Jewish roots when it comes to discipleship?
Well, quite frankly, I don't think that we've really ever I think as a whole, as the Western world, we've never really considered our Jewish roots all that much. I think that well, at least for me, in my experience, especially when I kind of stepped into Israel and I saw the Eastern world, and I saw the Bible as an Eastern book, because that's who wrote it, the people who lived in the Eastern world. And I, for the longest time, I thought, well, I'm contextualizing Jesus and his message in the Western world because that's who we are, that's our culture, and by doing that, we miss out on so much of what Jesus is communicating. We miss out on so much of understanding our faith, and so much of the richness and the goodness of what God's word is communicating to us as a body of believers. And so I think that I don't think it was purposeful. I don't think anybody was like, oh yeah, we need to uproot our Jewish roots. I think we just kind of went along. We were like, well, we're in America, and by golly, we're going to be Americans. You know what I mean? Like, I think
America.
America. I think that's just kind of what it was, and like I tell the story about how at the beginning of the book, in the introduction, I had a friend who asked me to come over her, say, hey, I've got some lettuce in my garden. I'm like, lettuce? Heck yeah. And so I go over there and I start using scissors, and I'm like, this is taking forever. And so I just start using my hands and I start pulling out the roots of this lettuce. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm pulling out the roots like nothing more is going to grow. Right. And
That's right.
in order for us, and like I tell the story in the book, my dad's parents, my grandparents on my dad's side are both passed away, and they passed away when I was, my grandpa I never knew. My grandmother passed away when I was 6, so I don't really know my dad's roots, but I do know my mother's roots because her parents are still alive, and it helps me as I get to know my grandparents on my mother's side better understand my mom and how she came to be and even who I've come to be. But there's that part of my dad's side that I don't know just because I didn't have the privilege of getting to know his parents like I did my mother's. And so the more that we get to know our Jewish roots, the more that we get to understand the Jesus whom we love.
Absolutely, and I at the very least, I mean, I know that at least for me, I try to when speaking, saying, "Hey, when you're trying to give context to when you're speaking or when you're doing a message or things like that, at least pause for 30 seconds and say, let me set the stage for you
Yeah,
of what is happening culturally within
sure.
the context of this." I mean, that would be a basic step,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, how then does a youth ministry, and this is where we're going to riff a little bit because it kind of brought to my mind, because
Hmm.
so many youth ministries are entrenched, right, in a specific way of doing things,
Uh-huh.
in an American way. So how do we then go, how does the average youth ministry begin to go back to those roots? How does the whole thing need to be deconstructed? Does a youth pastor listening or watching, they're like freaking out and going, oh my gosh, we're not Jewish enough. We've got to, we have got to get the ram's horn, which some churches do, by the way. That's perfectly fine.
Those
But
are
I think it needs to go a little bit beyond the ram's horn. A little bit, if you
awesome.
want to do that, by the way, I think your kids would love it. If you just did a ram's horn at the beginning of every youth meeting, why
Yes.
not?
Yeah, that might scare a couple, but the rest might stay. Yeah.
I think the students would know that meeting was starting.
That's
Maybe
a good
that's your way
idea.
of saying, hey, time to
Yeah,
gather,
I like it.
blow the horn.
You go first. Okay.
That's right. I'll tell you how that goes.
Yeah.
Um, so then if the person listening and watching says, but we're not Jewish enough, how do we fix that? Or am I completely off base? Am I like, what's my process here? How do I begin to think about going back to roots?
Sure. I think it honestly, it starts with you. What I mean by that is this is that, when I think about my teaching and prior to going to Israel, I've ignored a lot of the Old Testament. I just thought it was old. I thought it was not
It's in
really
you.
true. Good point. Uh, I just, I just thought it lacked relevance, and I was deeply wrong. And and so once I got back from there, I changed how I taught students. I tried with all my might to dig as deep as I could into the scriptures to help them understand what was going on culturally and historically, from the land in which the Bible was written. And so I think it starts with the individual to say, okay, am I willing to do the hard work and the research, and the digging deep on what I'm reading in scripture to help students really understand what's going on historically and culturally. So I think it's just kind of starting there, starting small. It doesn't have to be like, oh, we need to wear yarmulkes and celebrate Hanukkah, and our youth group is going to have Passover tonight, so everybody bring your lamb, we'll slaughter it. Like, I don't think I don't think we need to do that. I think it's just a matter of, it's those small little changes, right? And that's what I offer in the book on the different sections, is just, small little changes, small little suggestions and ways to start reintroducing what it means to maybe honor better our Jewish roots.
Right. And that's totally where I was going with that question, because I think those that are listening, those that are watching, this happens when we read a book or do something, say, oh, I'm doing it all wrong, and now I've got to somehow fix all this.
Yeah,
But just like you said, it's the small steps, and it comes from, like you said, your own personal, whether it's going through the Old Testament yourself, right? Don't make any massive
yeah.
changes in your youth ministry. Although I would say middle school boys would love to put lamb's blood on their doorpost every week. Somehow I just think they would
I
think that was cool.
I would agree with that sentiment. I would agree. They really
Boys, get the blood.
right.
And yeah,
Yeah.
and they'd have it like on their face. They'd be like painting them. Like, no, 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 that's not what that's for. Stop that.
What was that? What's that book where the kids like take over? There's no parents, and there's
Lord of the Flies.
yeah, and they have that pig and stuff. And there's blood.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's exactly how that meeting would go.
Yeah.
So the simple steps that you talk about, can you offer, go ahead and just give these folks that are listening and watching some security that
Yeah,
everything does not transform. We've already said, look, go through the Old Testament for yourself. Go
sure.
ahead and start journaling or start doing something. What
Mm.
are some other small steps that once a youth pastor says, you're right, I need to get back, looking at the Old Testament and finding what these roots are,
Mhm.
how then are some small changes that they can make, that youth workers can make to start, at least presenting the ideas to their students?
Um, so presenting the ideas to their students. Okay. So then I think it just starts with, making a small adjustment here and there. So, when you change your style of teaching, like,
Hmm.
hey, this week we're going to unpack what the word um, Talmud means, or we're going to unpack, um, what this name in the Bible means, this Hebrew name in the Bible means,
Hmm.
or something like that, So it's slowly but surely kind of reintroducing or taking our kids to that part, the Jewish parts of our faith, and letting them start to explore it for themselves as well. Does that kind of answer your question?
I
Or
think it does, because and I say that because sometimes youth pastors kind of like jerk the wheel,
yeah,
right? They like jump into it,
uh-huh,
and it like, so hey, we're not even going to give you any prep, students. We're not even going to let you know what's coming up. We're like, this is happening, and this
yeah,
is this. But youth pastors can segue a little bit easier and a little bit better through simple things like, if you're
absolutely,
doing a word study, right,
yep,
or doing a book of the Bible, if you want to do Exodus, if you're going to do a series anyway,
hmm,
because if you're going to do the book study, let's say in Sunday school or even on a Wednesday night or a Sunday night, at least you're studying it for yourself
right,
to make sure that you're getting it right, that you're going
yeah,
to be able to do that. So you're educating yourself before you're educating, the students. But
hmm.
are there any other ways you can think of that would help youth pastors say, okay, all right, we're going to go there with our students, even though, I don't know. I guess you can, youth pastors are thinking, yeah, but how can I make the Old Testament fun? It's old and it's a testament.
Yes, it's a covenant
It's a
indeed.
covenant.
Yeah,
So I know there's youth workers who maybe stay away from it. They stay a lot in the New Testament. They occasionally go back when they want to talk about, Gideon, or they want to talk about
sure.
Moses, or what I'm saying, but there's more to it
Yeah.
than that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because if we look at the life of Jesus, the book with which he taught from was the Old Testament. The book that he got excited about, the book that he helped people how understand how to follow God was the Old Testament. And if Jesus saw great value in the Old Testament, and if he loved it with his heart and his soul and his mind and his strength, and if he, that's the way that he taught others how to follow God. And man, if my Jesus gets excited about that, I'm sure that there's got to be a way for me to get excited about it too, right? And so I think if we start to see the Old Testament in a different light, not like this old book that just has dust on the covers, but a book that is living and active, right?
Yeah.
Sharper than any double-edged sword.
Right.
Um, that it really makes a difference. And I think as well, like in the way that I thought that you were going to go with this question, that I think maybe might be valuable to the discussion
Yes.
is that there's different components in my book that is more like, okay, here are some suggestions, here are some things that for you to consider as a youth worker, that from the life of a first century Jew, that is not, I'm not telling you exactly what to do. I'm giving you kind of a framework to work from and say, okay, now here's some things to consider and work this out however this looks for your youth ministry. For example, the Jews highly valued community. So what does that look like in your youth ministry? Does it mean that you enjoy more fellowship around the table? Does it mean that you laugh more often together? Does it mean that you, have a marathon movie night or something like that? You know what I mean? Like, what does it look like in your context to have more time in community? And then the Jewish first century world, they highly valued God's Torah, right? The Word of God. So what does it look like for you to help your students have a higher understanding, or excuse me, I should say a better understanding of the Word of God? And then another thing that the Jews, they valued was the Sabbath. What does it look like for me as a youth worker to take a step back, to cease and desist, and to just be at rest and at peace with God? And also Jesus in the community that he lived in valued doing life together. So what does that look like? Does that mean that my students and I go out every Friday night for ice cream? Does it mean that I invite my students over when I'm working on a project in my home so they learn how to do that? Or I help my students get to know some of the older adults in the congregation and, have an older gentleman teach them how to change the oil in their car. I mean, what does it look like for me to do life together with my students? The Jews highly valued the aged and the wisdom of the generations that had gone before them. So what does it look like for me to be more intergenerational in my ministry, where I'm inviting older congregation members into my ministry? Or what does it look like for me to, put a greater emphasis and value on the family and trying to integrate them more into the ministry? And so, there's a number of different practices within first century Judaism that we see that I think we all know and understand, but it's just good to be reminded of, and in light of what we're trying to accomplish in the journey of making disciples.
Perfect. Because in your book, you break down for youth pastors these values that are already doing, right? There's already the concept of family. There's already concept of Sunday. There's already concept of community, of discipleship making. And really what your book is challenging youth workers to do is look at each of those components through the lens of the book they're reading, of the source material, if you will, and say, how do we get back to something more real and more authentic in our relationships with each other and with the adults in our congregation?
Yeah, it's all about, and this is a big push in my book as well, is that Jesus was not about programs. The Jewish community was not about programs per se. They were about community and people and doing life together and relationships and, digging deep into sharing life together. I remember when I was in Israel and we learned about the Jewish wedding feast and how that all worked out and how integrated the family was in all of that, and how big, it was that the community came together in that. And, we, in our Western world, unfortunately, because of the busyness of our lives and all of that, we get to be so just kind of segregated, kind of just doing our own thing, isolated, and we lack that fresh community that we need. And so, there's a big push in my book to focus not so much on programs and the size of my youth group, but to just focus on loving people and forming a community of people who do that and who support each other, who walk alongside of one another.
Exactly. And like I said, we'd be here all day if I was simply pull from your book the story of New Life Fellowship. I believe it's New Life Fellowship. If we talked about that experience, and that's why you have to read the book. Read the book, because the way New Life Fellowship does a 3 weeks? A 3-week trip with a 3-week trip with their students. Reading that alone will challenge you, listeners, watchers, challenge you alone to do something different with your students.
Yeah, Pastor Billy and Katie are awesome. I mean, when I heard about this program, I was just blown away. And, Billy's a great friend of mine. We did youth ministry in the same area, and I always had a lot of admiration and respect for his youth ministry. And when I heard about this, I was like, holy moly, man, you got to tell me more. Like, you've got to tell me more about this ministry that you do with your students, because it's unreal. I mean, they're spending 24/7 with a small group of students for 3 weeks, they're getting to know each other. They're doing life together. And it's awesome. And that's why I love the stories in my book where I get to share about what God's doing through the life of other youth workers in the United States, and what, how they're investing in ways that are really making a big difference in the life of students. And it's because they're investing in relationships, and they're investing in the people that God has given them. And so, that I love the story of Jeannie and Cassidy, and the story of Ray, and all that, and those are some of my favorites for sure.
Well, let's jump into that, because that is in fact my next question, is that some of the stories in here, and you got to read the book for the stories and for how NLF does their program. It's broken down in there, all that stuff. But the story that I love the most is Jeannie and Cassidy, because, well, I'm going to let you explain it. You explain this. You're going to explain why I love it so much.
Well, that's fair, Paul. Let me hop into your head. Okay, got it. All right. So, Jeannie is a retired teacher. Cassidy, at the time when I interviewed them, was a senior in high school. And when I was working at the church, I was actually mentoring Cassidy. We would meet every other week or so and just kind of talk about Jesus and talk about life. And it was one day, I remember very specifically, I was down in the kitchen at the church, and I just sensed the Lord speak to me, you need to pass Cassidy off to Jeannie. And I was like, okay, I should probably talk to Jeannie first, right? And so
maybe.
Right? So I called Jeannie. I was called Jeannie. I was like, hey, here's what I really sensed from the Lord. She's like, okay, well, talk to her about it, and let's see. And I talked to Cassidy about it, and it was like, she didn't even have to think for half a second. She was like, yes. And I was like, part of me was like, aren't you sad? Like, aren't you sad? Don't you want me? Right? And right, whatever. And but then I was like, awesome. That's so awesome.
Now remind people, how old is Jeannie?
Well, I think there's a 50-year age gap between her and Cassidy.
Yes, so, right. Don't bury the lead, because that is it right there.
Yes.
The fact that there's a 50-year age difference between them.
Yes.
And the Lord told you and put it on your heart.
Yes.
That needs to be the mentoring relationship.
Yeah, because quite frankly, like when I think about Jeannie, I think about Cassidy, even though there's that age gap, that their personalities and their love for the Lord and their passion for him and their gifts were so similar that I was like, this just makes sense to me as well. And so it was so funny, because the two of them started meeting, and it was like an immediate bond. I mean, we're talking like a deep, immediate bond, where it went from just, getting together, a couple times a month, to where Cassidy's coming over to Jeannie's house just to hang out, just to do her homework, just to, spend time with her, where it wasn't so much about anything structured as it was just about enjoying time together. And I actually just so happened to text message Jeannie earlier today, and she's like, it's so great, Heather, because Cassidy is off at college now. And so one of the tensions or the fears was that both of them were like, we're just so sad that, we're not going to be able to spend as much time together. And Jeannie told me that Cassidy still calls her like once a week and says, just to check in or ask for prayer or to share what God's doing in her life or just to talk. And so it's a huge thing where, because Jeannie even says, and she's quoted in the book, like, she said, Heather, when you first asked me, I was like, well, can I relate? Right. Am I too old for this? And the truth of the matter is, and what I've learned in youth ministry, and I'm sure what you've learned as well, is that kids don't really care so much about age. They really don't. They're just looking for a safe place to land and somebody who will love them. And I found that with the older congregation members, they often have that wisdom and that love and that depth of character that is so needed in the life of a young person. And so, Jeannie and Cassidy is a great story in the book, because I just love to share about what God is doing in the lives of other people and how God is using them, and how God used Jeannie and Cassidy's life, and what a blessing that was to both of them.
And so many times those are the youth workers feel like they have to pick hip, cool people, which, by the way, older people are hip, cool people. They have a few more wrinkles than other people.
I mean, you're pretty cool, Paul, and you're old, so.
I am. Thank you for noticing. And I do. Listen, you laugh, but the other night I was speaking on a Sunday night. I spoke on Sunday night, and I was wearing I was wearing a Classically Trained t-shirt. It said Classically Trained, and it had Nintendo NES on it.
Yes.
Classically Trained.
Yes.
And you know who connected with me? Middle school boy
Is
who
that
reached
right?
out to me with complete empathy and said, "Cool shirt, man." And
That's
I'm
awesome.
like, "Look at that."
Yeah. Way to
Not
go.
bad, not bad for, almost a 52-year-old guy,
That's
right?
pretty sweet. Yeah.
But I think the older I get, the
Uh-huh.
more I understand, which I think that's the value of growing old, right? There's wisdom in that what I did not think about in my 20s about youth ministry and older adults connecting.
Yeah.
I have a much better understanding. And fortunately, I understood that in other churches that I've served. But the older I get, I see much more of the wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
especially what you convey in your book about these generations getting together and
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, we have more in common." And really, what that young man, for me, he just wanted to have a conversation. He wanted
Sure.
to talk about video games.
Right.
And I happened to just be there, and we were talking about it. That he didn't see a 52-year-old guy. He saw a guy that was interested in something that he was interested in.
Yes. Yeah.
And
And
that's
which
all and that's
which
all students want.
right, which ultimately made you become interested in him, right? Which made him feel special and important and valued, right?
Yes.
And
That's it.
so, yeah, it is. And it's interesting because I tell the story of Ray as well in my book, and that's probably my favorite story in the book because
Please. Please
yes,
tell it.
and that's in chapter 9.
Yep.
It was so wild to me because my friend Zach, Zachary Sandry, he's a youth pastor at a Heritage Church in Bettendorf, Iowa. And when Zach told because we had a youth pastors network that would meet every so often, and we did a training one time, and he told us I remember him telling us about his volunteer Ray, who was like 90 years old. And I'm like, what? Is that even real? Like, is that a thing? Like really? No way. And so when I started writing this book and I got to the chapter about the wisdom of the aged, I got a hold of Zach and I was like, look, is Ray still serving in your ministry? He's like, yeah. And he's like one of our most loved volunteers by the students. And I'm like, I have got to get to know this guy. And I sat down with Zach and I sat down with Ray and interviewed both of them. And it was just wild. When I was talking with Ray, he said that he started out serving in youth ministry at around the age of 70 years old.
It's a
Is when he
great time to
started.
start. A
That's when
great
he
time to start.
started. And because he's like, the youth pastor at our church left. And so me and another gentleman at the church said, let's fill in the gaps. And he's like, Heather, I've been doing youth ministry ever since, and I absolutely love it. And he said, Heather, if there's one thing I've learned is that kids are just, again, they're looking for somebody who cares.
Yep.
And I show that I care. And because I show that I care and that I'm invested in them and that I care about them and that I love them, kids are drawn to me. I mean, that's essentially what he said, is that kids know that I care. Therefore, they are good with me. They don't care that I'm 92 years old, and it was wild to me to hear his story. And just, he's like, Heather, when I was a teenager, things aren't really that much different than they are today. He's like, there's a smartphone. That's a little different. But really, what I went through, my fears and the different things that I experienced, teenagers are still experiencing today. So even though maybe I can't relate all the time culturally, I can definitely relate in other ways. And Ray's story it just excited me to say, wow, look what God can do in the life of the older generations to care for and love for the teenagers in our ministries.
And in the book, I believe he says too that really what he does is he prays for kids too, right? He just he'll
Yeah.
that the youth pastor will find Ray just praying for kids. And
Yes.
how I mean, if you're listening to this and or watching this and you say, I'm too old to do something, the minimum you can do, listen, you don't have to go and play trampoline, dodgeball, trampoline. You don't have to go to the trampoline place. You don't have to go to the lock-in. You can just pray with young people. Right. What a valuable connection that is, to simply say, I want to pray for you and invest my prayer into your life and invite the Lord into this mix of old and young.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ray says that he brings a bunch of 3x5 note cards with him every week to youth group. And he'll just ask kids, how can I pray for you? And he'll write down their prayer requests, and he prays for them throughout the week. And so he said, Heather, when I come back the following week, I ask that kid, how's things going with your grandma? How's things going with, that thing at school or that thing at home? He's like, kids know that I care because I ask about the things that I'm praying for them. Yeah.
Ray, God bless you, Ray.
Right? Isn't that awesome?
Wherever you're at, Ray, God bless you, brother. I love you. I just think that is so cool. And I hope when I'm 93, I'll be still like that. I would like to think that I'm going to keep my classically trained t-shirt available. I think I'll just have to keep that and wear that occasionally.
Agreed.
This is there's so much more. Like I said, Heather, we could go talk about the keys and student leadership. I'll just bring you back to talk about student leadership. Let's do that, because I want you to talk to youth workers now about when they finish reading this book and they say, look, what is the main thing you really want youth workers to get from this book? When they're done, they flip the last page, they're sitting there drinking their coffee, and they have that moment where they just kind of go, finished another youth ministry book. What do you want them to walk away from thinking about in their mind and saying,
I think I would want them to walk away saying, I can do this. I can do this. I can make one more step in the direction of unpacking my Jewish roots to get to know Jesus in a deeper way in the culture in which he came from. And just, like when I think I talk about there in a little spark that was lit inside of me after I got back from Israel. And my hope is that as they read this book, that there'll just be that little spark that'll just ignite in them to say, I want to continue to get to know Jesus and the Jewish world in which he came from, to help better understand how Jesus did discipleship, so that I can therefore become a disciple maker like Jesus was. And I'm not saying that my book or that my method is going to solve all the problems and it's going to make all the world better and we're all going to be these tremendous disciple makers because of it. But, I think there are some key things there, as you kind of brought up the keys, right? And there's a chapter in the book called The Keys to the Kingdom.
Yes.
And I talk about in there the age of the disciples. And I talk about what Jesus does with them at Caesarea Philippi. And I remember being in Caesarea Philippi in Israel. But before I get into that, I talk about the age of the disciples and how technically, and growing up, right? Like we looked at these pictures of the disciples and quite frankly, Paul, they looked like you, like they were older men, right?
You're right. And there's no question.
Yeah. And so in my mind, I thought, gosh, like the disciples were all older men. And that's what I thought, because
grumpy old men.
By golly, grumpy old men that played Nintendo. I don't know. But so, when I went to Israel and I learned that in the Jewish educational system that, young Jewish boys and girls start out in what's called, Bet Sefer. They start out in Bet Sefer, which is like primary school for boys and girls. And then at the end of that schooling, around the age of 10, the girls go home, the boys continue on in what's called Bet Midrash. And then it's only the best of the best who would then continue on in following a great rabbi. And for those Jewish boys who would follow a rabbi, the typical age that they would follow a rabbi would be around between 15 to 18 years old. And so, and when we look at the book of Matthew, chapter 17, we see Jesus and Peter, and only Jesus and Peter pay the temple tax. Now, and that was for people who are 20 years older and above. And so if Jesus is a righteous man, and we know that he is, he's not going to break the law. He's going to pay the temple tax if the other disciples are 20 years older and above. So we can safely assume, based upon the typical age that a young man would follow a rabbi, and based upon Matthew 17, that the disciples except for Peter, were in fact teenagers. And so that being said, in my book, The Keys to the Kingdom, I unpack just how important it is that we really invest in the generations of our young people and saying, hey, look, we believe that you are and can be the next future generations of the leaders of the church, and looking for ways to pass off those keys of leadership to them. Jesus says to his disciples in Caesarea Philippi, he says, as he's addressing Peter, right? And he says, I give you the keys to the kingdom of God, whether you bind on heaven, that chapter, that scripture. And I remember when I was in Israel, and we were standing there in Caesarea Philippi, and below us was this place where they worship the god Pan, right? And there's it was a goat sort of idol. And and the Jews believed that the gates of Hades resided in that area where they worshiped the god of Pan. So when Jesus says to Peter and the rest of the disciples, hey, look, here's the deal. You are going to go to places like this, and through my power, the gates of Hades will not prevail against you. So he gives him the keys to saying, hey, take the gospel to places like Caesarea Philippi, where you will be bombarded with evil, essentially, right? And so it's this idea of there are young people in our midst who have their own Caesarea Philippis. And we as youth workers and youth pastors should be called and equipped to equip them to bring the gospel to the places that are dark and in need of the love of God and in need of the gospel. So that Keys to the Kingdom chapter just really challenges the youth worker to say, hey, am I investing in and passing off those keys? Maybe it's as simple as, having a kid, training them up to give a message at youth group, or training them up and teaching them how to do tech, or encouraging them to serve on the music ministry, or looking for ways to get them plugged in to just places that would help hone in and train them up as leaders in the church. So.
And that's probably what do you have an example of maybe a student in your youth ministry right now that you've passed some keys off to?
Well, since I'm newer in my position here at Shelbyville and still kind of getting to know people, right. I've actually been really encouraged by the reality that was already happening when I came. And so there's kids who are serving on the tech team on Sunday mornings at the church. There's kids who I tell a story about Faith and Brandon in the book as well. Yep. Our worship pastor does an awesome job at this. He's got a teenage girl who's a senior in high school in my ministry, and he's training her up to be a worship leader at the church. She actually led her first song a couple weeks ago in church, and so eventually the goal is to get her to lead a whole set. And so that's happening at my church, and that's something that the church is already bought into. It's not necessarily something that I had to push or get people to rally around.
And that is a great point, because not every youth worker who's listening and not every youth worker who is watching is in a context where they believe that.
Sure.
That the church does not believe that. So there's not a lot of handing down. There's not a lot of keys being handed out. It's, there's a lot of gatekeeping. They're not passing out the keys. Nope, stay away from the keys, please. The keys are mine, and we're not going to give them to you. So we have to remind, that discipleship is a progressive thing. It's small things. It's not it's not an information dump. It's not a class is taught. It's a life that progresses as we hand out keys and opportunities, small keys and big keys, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I remember one time I had a student who I challenged to lead a breakout session for our fall retreat. And I was, checking in with her often, and what do you need? What do you need? And it got down to the point where she didn't have anything ready. And I had to take that key away and we had to talk about it. And we just had a conversation. We said, okay, what can we do differently next time how can I help you get to the point where you've got that breakout session ready to go, so that, we can step into that both feeling confident, right? Because she
Right.
realized she dropped the ball,
Yep.
right? But that's what doing life together is, right?
That's what discipleship is.
That's what discipleship is. And it's okay that she messed up, right? It's
Yeah.
totally fine.
Yep.
Because I've messed up, right?
Yep.
And we all need that grace. And we see that in the life of Peter, right? We see he totally screwed up. And Jesus says, hey, I love you still. And I'm going to give you even greater keys of leadership because you've been humbled now.
That's right. You make that point clear in the book that even in spite of, he got greater keys in Acts chapter 2. He got and 3 and 4. He had the keys just kept on coming, regardless of the mistakes he made in the past. And and you encourage youth workers, don't hold those mistakes against those kids. Teach them, train them, release them, and give them the keys back. Don't just say that you can't do it anymore, but help them along a little bit to where they can hold the keys correctly.
Right. We have to keep believing in people. I think so often in the church world, sometimes it's about how do we look to other people? Are we successful? And because of that, we kind of treat people like, well, you became a problem here. So therefore, we're just going to move along from you because you kind of keep screwing up. So you're making us look bad and we need to look good. So we need to kind of move a different direction. And I think that Jesus shows us that, hey, we have to be willing to work with people and believe in them and speak that into them. Because if we look at the life of the disciples, I'm totally going to open another can here, but we see that.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
We see that from a Jewish perspective that, these disciples were out doing their father's trade. They were tax collectors, they were fishermen, they were working, right? And so we see that they're no longer in the Jewish educational system, which means that they weren't the best of the best. They weren't the ones that everybody said, you have what it takes in order to follow after a rabbi. They were the ones that everybody said, yeah, maybe you should just go be a fisherman.
Pass.
Right? Right, pass. And Jesus said, I believe in you. Peter, James, John, Andrew, and on and on. I think that you can be like me. Wow, what an overwhelming thing that must have been for them, that somebody said, I believe in you, and kept believing in them, despite the fact that I'm sure that they had quite a few mishaps along the way, right? And so that's just what our students need as well. Just as much as you and I need that, they need that too, somebody to say, I believe in you. You have what it takes.
Well, I believe in you, Heather.
Thanks, Paul.
I think you have what it takes.
That's nice.
In the book, and we'll wrap with this, I think, is because it's not, I don't think it is a book about youth ministry. It's a book, but because I think the whole chapter on Sabbath rest speaks to youth workers directly. And so many youth workers struggle with that. Would you just talk briefly about that fact from our Jewish roots, that we're not doing Sabbath rest correctly? Most of us are not doing Sabbath rest correctly.
Yeah.
What should a youth pastor be thinking about when he's considering, because there's high burnout rates, there's high depression, there's loneliness, there's all kinds of things that goes on in the world of a youth worker and people in general, mostly because they're not taking a rest, they're not doing that. What would you say from your book that you would say, look, pay attention to this?
Yeah, I think, well, the word Shabbat, right, in the Hebrew means to cease, desist, to rest. And I remember I was that person that you explained a few years ago. I was literally on the brink of burnout because I was just doing, going, because the youth ministry calendar just tends to be very fast paced. It's very full. There's always a retreat, an overnight, something going on, and you're just go. And if you don't create space and time for rest, you will do just that. You will burn out. And, in that chapter, I encourage people to do what I call the art of Sabbath, right? And behind what the Sabbath encourages us to do is to rest and be with the Lord. And so I remember a few years ago, I made the decision to essentially take a time out, right? And to say, okay, I need to schedule out one day a week where this is my day to just say, okay, I'm not jam packing it with a bunch of stuff. I'm just going to do things that create a rhythm in my life of joy and of peace and not of chaos. Because I remember there were some weeks where I was like, okay, I can do this. My Sabbath day is coming soon, right? Like my Friday is coming. I can do this. I can make it. And that day would come and I would just kind of go, right? Like, and I could just kind of recharge and get back together with myself and with the Lord. And just kind of not worry about doing. I could just be a person, and that was the journey that God really took me on when I stepped away from ministry for a season was, I just need to figure out how to be a child of God and how to just be a person and how to say, you know what, I'm not my performance. I'm not my ministry results. I'm not all these things that people pat me on the back for. I'm just a child of God. And I think that Sabbath helps us understand that we are not the results at the end of the page. We're not like, oh, I had 100 kids show up for this thing, or, oh, look at me, I wrote a book. Like I'm just a person. I'm just a person who is in need of the grace of God and who needs community and who needs people to say, you've got what it takes, Heather, and who love me for me and who want me to be like Jesus and who encourages me in my walk, right? And so I think that heart of Sabbath to say, I need to take a step back and to just be with Jesus. And because, even for a season in my life, it was like really rushed time with God, right? Like it was just like, okay, I gotta get through this devotional. So, I'll just do it. Right. And it was like, just a check on the box. And then it was on to the next ministry thing. Right. And man, that just wore me out. And I came to this realization that Sabbath is a rhythm that I've put into my life, or what I would call the art of Sabbath, that need for rest as a daily thing too, and taking time every single morning to spend time in the Word, to spend time in prayer, and to carve out a good, 45 minutes to an hour is usually what I carve out. It's sometimes more, and it's just that time where I can just be at rest and be with God and be in prayer and to listen and to hear from Him. That's just a practice and an art that we have not done well, because I was that youth worker who just ran and I didn't listen because I was so busy running. And I was doing things that I wasn't supposed to be doing, but it was things that my fear or my insecurity told me that I needed to do. And when I actually started taking a step back and listening to the Lord, I started doing less, but God was creating more through my less, because of the greater abundance that He was putting into me. And so, yeah, let's all just take a nap. Okay. Right. Like seriously, let's all take a holy nap and say, you know what? I'm just going to be with Jesus and not worry about my performance or trying to do or become somebody in the eyes of people. Right.
That's right. Ministry is a cruel mistress.
Yeah, man.
It will not treat you kindly. It will not treat you well. God cares more about the minister than the ministry, as we say, right?
You got it.
So good, Heather. Heather, I'm so glad we've had this conversation. I'm so glad that youth workers get to hear about your book. That is phenomenal. And it is First Century Youth Ministry, Exploring Our Jewish Roots to Reclaim Discipleship.
Yeah.
If people want to ask you more questions, if they want to get in touch with you or anything like that, where do you recommend sending them? Where would you like to go?
I have a Facebook page. It's my name, and then it's an author page, so they can like my page.
Yes, please like your page.
Yeah, so I would prefer that over like, hey, I'm just going to add her as a friend, and I'll be like, who's that person? I don't know you. So just find my author page on Facebook, like my page, and they can stay up to date. They can send me messages. I'm also actually just started every Monday for the next few weeks. I'm going to be putting out a new resource on YouTube. They're about these like 3 to 4 minute videos of just these teachings. Like my first one was on the word Talmud. What does it mean? Why is it important? my next video I'll put out next Monday, and they can find me on YouTube as well under my name. And they can subscribe to my YouTube channel. But definitely the best place to go would be to my Facebook page, which is Heather Quiroz author page. So yeah.
Okay, well, if you do that, listeners, watchers, if you will do that, just say, look, we heard you on the podcast. We heard you on the Youth Ministry in Motion podcast.
Yeah.
Paul Turner sent us. We want to be friends with you.
Awesome. I love it.
Heather, thanks you so much for your time. And we will have you back very, very soon to talk more about discipleship.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Heather.
I've enjoyed it.
And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Please, once again, leave me your comments down below. Would love your feedback on these long form videos and these interviews if you enjoy them. Also, if you're a regular, thank you so much for stopping by. I love your feedback. I love when you hit the thumbs up button. That tells me you like the video and you want more of them. And lots of more videos coming up in the next week, so stay tuned for that. All right, that's it for today, guys. We'll catch you guys in the next video.